So, I want to share something that's been stuck in my head for years. It's one of those moments that, for better or worse, shaped a part of who I am today. I was 14 at the time, and my cousin and I had this kind of bond where we'd get into a lot of mischief together. You know, like the kind of bond where you're not just cousins, you're almost partners in crime. One day, we were hanging out at my uncle's place, just the two of us. It was the kind of day where nothing seemed off until we found the gun stash in his closet. To this day, I don't know if it was an accident or if my uncle had intentionally hidden them, but we found it. And that's where things went from 0 to 100. My cousin grabbed one of the guns without thinking and, in a moment of what I can only describe as a dumb teenage impulse, pointed it straight at my head. My heart stopped. I froze. I immediately told him to stop, to put the gun down. It wasn't funny. But he just looked at me, a smirk on his face, and said it wasn't loaded. I tried to shake it off, but honestly, I was scared. I mean, who wouldn't be? He had a gun pointed at my head. But he was my cousin, right? And we were always doing stupid things together. So, I guess in some twisted part of my brain, I believed him. He lowered the gun, pointed it at the floor, and pulled the trigger. There was a loud bang. And then, the floor. It didn't just make a hole. The impact was so strong that pieces of the floorboard flew up. My mind went completely blank. It took me a few seconds to process what had just happened. My cousin was still holding the gun, looking down at the hole in the floor as if nothing was wrong. I couldn't breathe. "That was loaded," I whispered, barely able to form the words. He turned to me, his face pale now, his smirk gone. I didn't know." He stammered. That was when it hit me. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't just a stupid prank. He could have killed me. And that thought? It stayed with me for a long time. For the next few minutes, we just stood there, frozen in the moment. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat on my palms. It wasn't like I was mad at him immediately, but I was in complete shock. He looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. I don't think he had fully realized what he'd done until that moment. He dropped the gun to the ground, and we both stood there in silence. Neither of us knew what to say. I wanted to scream, to shout at him for being so reckless, but I couldn't. I was too scared, too shaken up. Finally, I spoke. "You're an idiot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't even angry yet, just scared. My cousin didn't respond. He just stared at the hole in the floor, looking completely lost. There was no more smirking, no more acting tough. He was just a kid, just like me, caught up in something far bigger than we understood. I remember thinking, this could have been it. This could have been the end. I didn't know what to do next. Should I tell my uncle? Should I tell anyone? We'd already crossed a line. If I told, there'd be no going back. We didn't talk about it much after that. We just went on as if nothing happened. But it wasn't the same. It couldn't be. Every time I saw my cousin after that, I'd remember the gun. The hole in the floor. The fact that he had nearly killed me without even realizing it. It was like this silent thing between us, unspoken but always there. He was different too. It's hard to explain, but there was this unease around him now. Before, we'd always been able to joke around and get into trouble together, but after that day, I could see the guilt in his eyes. Every time we'd hang out, he'd be a little quieter, a little more withdrawn. It was like we both knew something had changed, but neither of us knew how to deal with it. I think we both thought we could just forget about it. Pretend like it never happened. But deep down, I think we both knew that it had impacted us more than we cared to admit. One day, a few weeks later, I was at his place, and for some reason, the memory resurfaced. I didn't plan to bring it up. I didn't think I could handle talking about it, but it just slipped out. I said, "You remember the gun, right?" He froze. For a moment, I thought maybe he was going to deny it, pretend it never happened. But then, he broke down. He started crying, right there in front of me. his face twisted with guilt and regret. "I'm sorry," he kept repeating. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear." It was the first time I saw him that vulnerable, that human. It hit me harder than I expected. My cousin, the one who had always been so tough, had never shown any sign of weakness, and now he was completely falling apart. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, feeling the weight of the moment. It was like both of us were realizing just how close we'd come to losing everything. And we still had no idea how to handle it. After that day, things between my cousin and me were never quite the same. There was this invisible wall between us now, built from guilt and fear. I didn't know if I could ever look at him the same way again. Every time I saw him, the image of that gun pointed at my head came rushing back. It haunted me, and I could feel it eating away at our bond. I wanted to forgive him. I really did. But I didn't know how. How could I just brush it off when what happened could have ended my life? The trust we had was shattered, and no amount of apologies could put it back together. And yet, every time I looked into his eyes, I saw the same pain I felt. He had made a mistake, a huge one, but it didn't seem like he had done it out of malice. He was just careless. But that carelessness nearly cost me everything. It was hard for me to admit this, but I realized I was angry. Angrier than I had been in a long time. But it wasn't just anger at him, it was anger at myself too. I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done something. I should have stopped him sooner, yelled at him harder, or even just walked away. But I didn't. And now we were both left trying to pick up the pieces of something that couldn't really be fixed. There were times when I wanted to distance myself from him, to just cut ties and walk away. But I couldn't. Not completely. He was still my cousin, and despite everything, I still cared about him. That's the complicated part of it all. How do you walk away from someone who hurt you, but also someone you shared so many memories with? I think that's when I started to understand that forgiveness isn't just for the other person, it's for you too. It wasn't about forgetting what happened. It wasn't about pretending that it didn't matter. It was about accepting that we were both flawed, both human, and that maybe, just maybe, we could heal together. I spent a lot of time thinking about the incident, more than I ever expected. It was like the weight of it was pressing down on me, even when I was trying to move on. I tried distracting myself with school, friends, anything I could do to avoid confronting what had happened. But the truth was, I couldn't escape it. The moment kept replaying in my mind, like a broken record. One night, after weeks of silent tension between us, my cousin reached out. It wasn't anything big, just a text. But it was the first time he'd initiated anything since that day. He asked if I wanted to meet up. And for some reason, I agreed. When I showed up, I expected more of the same awkward silences, avoiding the elephant in the room. But instead, we actually talked. Really talked. It wasn't easy. He apologized again, more earnestly than I'd ever heard him before. He admitted that he didn't realize the gravity of what he'd done. He confessed that part of him didn't want to face it, didn't want to face the fact that he could have taken my life in that moment. It was a lot to take in, but at that point, I was starting to understand. It wasn't just about what he had done, it was about how we both had carried that guilt with us. We hadn't talked about it, and that made it fester. For the first time since the incident, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. Not because I forgave him right away, but because we were finally facing it together. That was the beginning of our healing. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. We spent the evening talking about other things too, old memories, dumb inside jokes, and everything that used to make our relationship easy. And slowly, it felt like we were getting back to who we used to be, just a little bit at a time. That night, I realized that healing isn't linear. It's messy and it takes time. Sometimes, you have to sit with the pain before you can move past it. But the first step is always acknowledging it. The thing about trauma is that it doesn't just go away. Even after that conversation with my cousin, even after all the tears and apologies, there were still moments when the weight of it would hit me out of nowhere. It was like I couldn't fully move on until I came to terms with what happened, until I accepted that the past had shaped me in ways I wasn't ready for. A few days after our talk, I found myself standing in front of my uncle's closet again. The same closet where we had found the gun stash. The same closet that, for so long, had felt like a symbol of danger and uncertainty. I don't know why I went there, maybe to try to make sense of it all, or maybe because I needed to confront the source of the fear that had been hanging over me. As I opened the closet door, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. But there was something else too, something I couldn't put into words. It wasn't just the gun stash. It was the fact that I had never really dealt with the fear that came with that moment. The fear of knowing how close I had come to losing everything. I ran my fingers over the shelves, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the source of everything. But then, something strange happened. Instead of feeling angry or scared, I felt relief. It was like, by confronting this space, I was finally giving myself permission to let go of some of the fear I'd been carrying around. I could never erase what happened, but I didn't have to let it control me anymore. I closed the closet door, took a deep breath, and walked away. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't a huge revelation. But it was a turning point. I had faced the truth. And in doing so, I had taken the first real step toward healing. It wasn't about forgetting or pretending it didn't matter. It was about accepting what happened and allowing myself to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to do just that. Even after I thought I had faced the truth, the guilt didn't fully leave. I convinced myself that confronting the closet was some kind of breakthrough, but there were still lingering thoughts, still flashes of the moment the gun had been pointed at my head. The guilt would creep up at the strangest times, when I was with my family, when I was hanging out with friends, or even when I was alone late at night, lying in bed. I would catch myself wondering, what if I had reacted differently? What if I had shouted, or run, or done something more than just freeze in that moment? The what-ifs kept me up at night. I knew my cousin felt guilty, but I hadn't realized just how much that moment had affected me too. The weight of not doing something when I had the chance started to feel as heavy as the guilt he was carrying. I remember talking to my best friend about it one day. I'd been holding it in for so long, and I needed someone to help me make sense of all the conflicting emotions. I wasn't sure how she would react, but when I told her what happened, she didn't judge me. She just listened. "I don't think it's about what you did or didn't do," she said, after a long pause. "You were a kid. And kids freeze in those kinds of situations. It's not about being brave or making the right decision. It's about surviving." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Surviving. That was what I had done. I hadn't been able to change the situation or control it, but I had made it out alive. And that, in itself, was something. It wasn't a solution, and it didn't magically take away the guilt. But it helped me realize that sometimes, there's nothing more you can do than survive. And that's enough. It was a tough pill to swallow, but it was one step closer to letting go of the burden. As time went on, I began to notice a subtle shift in the way I viewed the situation. The raw, gut-wrenching pain of that moment started to fade, replaced by something that felt more like a lesson learned than a scar. I was still haunted by the event, but the feeling wasn't as sharp as it had been. Instead, there was an underlying understanding that I couldn't change the past, and that trying to would only keep me stuck in a cycle of guilt. The first time I saw my cousin after our deep conversation, it was different. There was a sort of unspoken agreement between us now, an acknowledgement of the past, but also a recognition that we had to move forward. We didn't talk about the gun again. We didn't need to. What we had both learned from that day had already been said in the way we looked at each other. The bond wasn't the same, but it had evolved. It had become something more real, more honest. I began to realize that what we had gone through had changed us both. My cousin wasn't the carefree, impulsive kid he used to be. And I wasn't the same either. The innocence we once shared was gone, replaced by a new kind of maturity, one that came with the knowledge that life could change in an instant, and that we had to take responsibility for our actions, no matter how small or big. But it wasn't just about the guilt or the fear anymore. It was about the strength we had both found in surviving. We were still standing. Still breathing. Still here. And that, I realized, was something to be grateful for. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. In a way, the incident had become a turning point. Not just in my relationship with my cousin, but in the way I approached life. It was a reminder that I couldn't control everything. I couldn't undo the past. But I could choose how to respond to it. And that was a powerful realization. The weeks after that conversation were quieter. It wasn't that everything was magically fixed, but there was a certain peace that started to settle in. It wasn't a grand moment of closure, it was more like the gradual dimming of a storm. The weight that had been pressing on my chest seemed a little lighter, and though the scars from that day would always remain, they weren't as raw as before. I started to look at my cousin differently, but not in a bad way. It wasn't like I'd completely forgiven him or that I'd forgotten what happened, but I began to see him as someone who had learned from the past, just like me. We both had our flaws. We both had made mistakes. But we had also survived. That made us stronger, even if we hadn't realized it at the time. One evening, months after the incident, we were hanging out again. This time, it was just like old times, no awkward tension, no unsaid words hanging in the air. It felt normal. Not perfect, but okay. We joked around, talked about stupid stuff, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were actually enjoying each other's company again. It was in that moment, amidst the casual laughter, that I realized something: I had grown. Not just because I had learned to forgive, but because I had come to understand that the human experience is messy. People make mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes can be life-altering. But that doesn't mean it has to be the end of everything. I think that's the real lesson I took away from it all. That no matter how bad something gets, you can still choose how to move forward. You can still find strength in the midst of chaos, and even in the deepest moments of regret, there's room for growth. I had learned to live with the truth of that day, and I had come out the other side stronger for it. The road wasn't easy, but every step I took was a step toward healing. And that was enough. As time passed, I realized the impact of that day wasn't just limited to my relationship with my cousin. It affected how I viewed the world, how I viewed myself. I started questioning everything I had taken for granted before, the idea of safety, trust, and how easily they could be broken. I began to take a harder look at the people around me. I noticed how quickly things could change, how one wrong decision could alter the course of everything. It made me more cautious in my relationships, more aware of the risks people took, and how easily lives could be shattered by carelessness or thoughtlessness. I remember a conversation I had with a friend not long after. We were talking about life, and I mentioned how the incident with the gun had affected me in ways I didn't expect. She said something that stuck with me: it's not about the bad things that happen to you, it's about what you do with them afterward. That hit me hard. I hadn't just survived that moment with my cousin. I was still living with the consequences of it, in my thoughts, in my actions, in how I approached the world. But that didn't mean I was a prisoner of it. The event had shaken me to my core, but it also forced me to re-evaluate everything I thought I knew about myself and others. The guilt didn't just linger in my relationship with my cousin. It had rippled out into every corner of my life. But slowly, as I faced it and started to move forward, I realized something crucial: I didn't have to let it control me. The story didn't have to end with regret. The way I responded to that moment, the way we both responded, could define us. I didn't have to be defined by my mistakes or by what had happened. I could choose who I was, and what I became, in spite of everything. That realization was freeing in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't have to let the past dictate my future. And that was one of the most empowering things I had ever learned. It's strange how trauma can change the way you see the people around you. My cousin and I never spoke about the gun again after that night he cried in front of me. It became this quiet thing between us, a shared experience we both carried but never discussed. But the truth was, we didn't need to talk about it anymore. We'd already done that. We'd already confronted the past in the only way we could, together, silently, and with the understanding that it had impacted both of us in ways that words couldn't fully explain. We didn't need to say anything more. Our bond had evolved from something innocent into something more real, more resilient. I think, in a way, that unspoken bond became the foundation of our relationship moving forward. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what we had learned and how we had come through it. And somehow, that brought us closer than we had ever been before. There were moments when I'd catch myself looking at him, wondering how I could still be friends with someone who had almost ended my life. But then I'd remember that we were both just kids, struggling to figure out our place in a world that was often far too big and too unpredictable for us to handle. He hadn't meant to hurt me. He hadn't meant to put me in that position. He had just been careless, like so many of us are when we think we're invincible. And I had been just as reckless, too, by not speaking up sooner, by not walking away, by not making a bigger deal out of the fact that we were holding a loaded weapon. We both shared the blame, but we also shared the survival. And that, in the end, was what mattered. I realized that, in some weird way, we were both stronger because of what had happened. Not because it had been easy or simple, but because we had survived it together. That's what made us who we were. Not the past mistakes, not the gun, but the fact that we had weathered the storm and come out the other side, still standing, still human, still learning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like that was enough. Months had passed, and the incident with the gun had slowly become a distant memory, not in the sense that it didn't matter anymore, but more in the sense that it no longer controlled the narrative of my life. I had been carrying the weight of it for so long, but now, it felt like it was finally starting to fade into the background of everything else. One evening, as I was sitting alone, I started reflecting on how far I'd come. The person I was at 14, the one who had stood frozen in front of that gun, felt like someone else. The guilt, the fear, the confusion, they were still there, but they weren't the defining features of my life anymore. I had grown, and not just in the way you grow older, but in the way you grow through hardship. I had learned about survival, about resilience, and about the complicated nature of forgiveness. But most of all, I had learned that life is unpredictable, and sometimes, the only thing you can control is how you respond to the things that happen to you. The decisions you make in the aftermath are what define you. And for the first time, I was okay with that. It wasn't about blaming my cousin, or even blaming myself. It was about understanding that what happened that day didn't have to be the defining moment of my life. It could be part of my story, but it didn't have to be the only part. The lessons I'd learned, the growth I had gone through, that was the part one wanted to focus on. I realized, looking back, that what mattered was how I chose to live with the experience. I wasn't going to let it consume me. I wasn't going to let it keep me in the past. Life had its way of throwing curveballs, but it also had its way of pushing you to become stronger than you ever thought you could be. I was no longer a 14-year-old kid caught in a moment of fear. I was someone who had faced the consequences of that moment, reflected on it, and chosen to move forward. That was what made me who I was now. And I knew that, no matter what came next, I would be ready. With the weight of the past slowly lifting, I began to focus more on the present, on the relationships I had, the people who mattered, and the life I was trying to build for myself. It was clear that the event with my cousin would always be a part of me, but it no longer had the power to overshadow everything else. I had finally found a way to integrate that part of my life into who I was becoming, without letting it define me entirely. One thing I noticed was how much more aware I became of my surroundings. I didn't take anything for granted anymore, whether it was the safety of a simple conversation, the trust one placed in others, or the time I spent with the people I cared about. Life was fragile, and every moment mattered more than it ever had before. And in a way, I think it was the emotional scars that made me more empathetic. I became more understanding of the mistakes people made, more forgiving when they were careless, and more open when others needed support. I realized that no one is perfect, and that everyone has their own burdens to carry. The key was not to judge, but to support, to listen, and to offer kindness in the face of imperfection. As for my cousin, we were slowly rebuilding our relationship, but it wasn't like it was before. We weren't pretending that nothing had happened. We both knew that our bond had changed, that we had both been shaped by that moment in ways we couldn't fully articulate. But it was a new kind of bond, one forged in the fire of our shared experience. And even though we couldn't undo the past, we were both learning how to move forward, together. The truth was, there were no shortcuts to healing. There was no single moment of closure or final aha that would make everything okay. It was an ongoing process, one that required patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to embrace the messy, unpredictable journey of life. And slowly, day by day, I was learning to let go of the past, not because I wanted to forget, but because I understood that the future couldn't be built on regret. It was about living fully, with the awareness that the past had shaped me, but it didn't own me. I was moving forward, and that was the most powerful thing I could do. Looking back now, I realize how much that one event shaped me. It was more than just an incident with a gun, it was a lesson in trust, in fear, and in the deep complexities of human relationships. It was a moment that could have shattered everything, but instead, it became the starting point for something different. I learned that life is unpredictable, that things can change in the blink of an eye, but also that we have the power to decide how we respond to those changes. I learned that sometimes, surviving isn't about making the right decision in the heat of the moment, it's about how you pick up the pieces afterward and move forward. It's about how you allow yourself to heal, how you find the strength to forgive, and how you learn to grow from the things that nearly broke you. My cousin and I never fully returned to the way things were before that day. And honestly, I'm glad for that. Sometimes, the relationships we have before a traumatic event aren't the ones we need afterward. People change, and sometimes they change for the better. We're both different now, but in a way that's made us more honest with each other, more real, more aware of the fragility of life. The biggest lesson I can give to anyone who's been through something similar is this: don't let the past define you. The mistakes, the moments of weakness, the things you can't take back, those are all part of the story, but they're not the whole story. The way you move forward is what matters most. And if you can find a way to forgive yourself, to forgive others, and to learn from what happened, then you'll come out of it stronger than you ever imagined. At the end of the day, it's not the bad things that happen to you that shape your future. It's the way you rise from them. The strength you find in the aftermath. And that's a strength that no one can take away from you. As for me, I'm still moving forward, one step at a time. The past is still there, but it no longer has control. It's just a part of who I am now, an experience that shaped me, yes, but doesn't define me. I'll carry the lessons with me, but I won't let them hold me back. And that, I think, is the most important thing I've learned.